Welcome back to the Midway podcast. One of the questions that we're now starting to face as a society is whether there is an inherent meaning to the universe, or is everything simply random? Is there such a thing as something that's inherently good, or are our morals and ethics just the result of the stories that we tell ourselves as human beings, the result of different neurons firing in certain ways in our brain? Are there principles that underlie and undergird everything? Why is it that when we see a baby in trouble that we would drop everything to help it? Why do you feel a sense of beauty when looking out at nature? Are these things simply arbitrary? It seems like we're entering an era where the dominant paradigm of what we believe is true is being questioned. That paradigm is based on scientism, objectivism, materialism, and moral relativism. There's holes starting to be poked in this story, as if something within us wants to get a glimpse of something different or knows that there's a new way of being, a better way of being in the world. We see this playing out in our sociocultural and political space. Even over the past few years, for example, with COVID, the narrative about what is true, what is healthy, what is good is being challenged by a large portion of the general population. In our political space, RFK now being nominated and potentially confirmed as the head of HHS. And whether the old story or the new story is more true is less important than the fact that our stories are being updated, which is a critical process for our evolutionary growth. The capacity to question and challenge and constantly iterate and update our stories and therefore our consciousness is crucial to discovering the truth, or else we become static. There's too much order. I've been reading Jordan Peterson's book recently, We Who Wrestle with God. Jordan's work being increasingly popular in our society, especially his past 3 books. Why are we being drawn to, again, religion? This most recent book being about really Christianity and the values and principles that are embedded within it, and how these show up in our everyday lives, how there might be something that's inherently good. Dr. Peterson might say something like, well, okay, it's not exactly obvious to me that that's not even true. It's like you need something to aim at. If not, that's not good, man. It's like, you don't want to end up bitter and resentful. That's not good, man. It's like, good luck with that. All right, I just want an excuse to get my Jordan Peterson impression in there. But why are we being drawn increasingly to this type of material? Is there something within us that is being called back to the first principles and values that were lost in our current paradigm of objectivism? And is there a way of reconciling those in a way that can also leave behind the negative aspects of religion that have really been responsible or have been involved in some of the most atrocious parts of our human history? Is there a way to extract those principles? My guest today is the inimitable Dr. Zachary Stein. He's the co-founder of the Civilization Research Institute and the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. He was trained at the interface of philosophy, psychology, and education, and now works in fields related to the mitigation of global catastrophic risk. Zach is a widely sought after and award-winning speaker and a leading authority figure on education and contemporary issues in human development. He's the author of dozens of published papers and 2 books, including Education in a Time Between Worlds. In this episode today, we touch on what Zach and his colleagues and others have referred to as the meta crisis and how this relates to the existential threats that are human created that we're currently facing today. Zach educates us on the difference between what I was referring to earlier as moral relativism, or the idea that everything, including our morals and ethics, are simply made up, versus the notion that there might be some inherent principles and values and things that are good, that are embedded within the universe. And him and his colleagues have written a book on this, which we talk about, of that title, called First Principles and First Values. Zach and I talk about how value is encoded in the universe, free will versus determinism, the myth of the march of progress, and questioning whether the continual growth of technology is good. We talk about how global stress, things happening in the world, is heightening the sense of separateness and isolation, and the relativistic story that we tell, and what Zach refers to as techno-feudalism, and how this is moving us closer to a tipping point. We touch on Ian McGilchrist's work on the left and right hemispheres of the brain and how these are showing up in the collective as far as the imbalances. We talk about how attention or awareness can act as an organizing force to create more order and health and intimacy and interrelation and evolution in the universe. And much, much more. Zach is so full of knowledge that I know that we could have talked for 10 hours straight and just scratched the surface together. This is a really deep episode, so if you're up for a philosophical conversation, then I would say just to jump right in, and I hope that you really enjoyed this episode.
I have the wonderful privilege of talking today with Zak Stein. Zach, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I'm wondering if you could get us started by telling us a little bit about you. I would love to hear a little bit more about both your scholarly background, but also just you personally, if you're open to sharing, like where you grew up and what brought you to studying and being interested in philosophy, religion, psychology.
Right. Let's see. Born in Kansas, spent a lot of time in the Midwest, but really raised in the Northeast, and then eventually in Massachusetts, and kind of more specifically in the area where the transcendentalists emerged from, outside of Boston. And so in high school, I was reading Emerson and the Tao Te Ching. So I got really lucky in terms of being in a situation where you can be reading books in high school and reflecting about these things. But I was a musician, and so I was trying to find a way to explore these things through art, through music. And in college, I began to read the biographies of the great jazz artists that I admired the most. So Coltrane, Sun Ra, Miles Davis, these guys. Coltrane in particular had been reading Aldous Huxley and doing acid and stuff. And in his last interview, actually, he was asked, "You're such a masterful musician, what's next?" And he basically said, "I would like to be a saint." That was super interesting to me. And so I started reading what they were reading. And he meant that because he'd been reading the perennial philosophy. So he had an idea in mind of an awakened being, basically. And he was actually using his music as a meditative practice, more internally focused when performing than concerned about the audience. So if you listen to the late Coltrane, it's like Stockhausen or John Cage. It's like experimental, crazy stuff. It's worth checking out. So it was in that context that I began to just like more formally explore questions of religion. And at one point basically started thinking more about philosophical problems than I was about music. Like I'd be like practicing or even performing and be like noodling on some philosophical idea. And so that was an important sign. And music was a different kind of thing than actually what I had a stomach for. So for many reasons, actually, some too private to share, I ended up uh, refocusing, thinking of myself as some kind of like philosopher or something, even though I was, so young. Uh, uh, Ken Wilber was very formative to me, uh, around 22, 23. And by chance, again, met psychologist, Theo Dawson, um, who was working in a neo-Piagetian framework and was saying a lot of the things that Ken was saying about the transformation of human capacity towards these unprecedented potentials and how relevant that was for everyday people. So that led me to kind of begin to explore developmental psychology, but with an interest in these broadly religious topics, and while also pursuing all the philosophical kind of doors that my prior reading and Ken in particular opened for me. And then it was just off to the races. I mean, I again was very fortunate to, you know, be in a position to be able to study, just to really study and work. Began practicing in Zen meditation, then began work with, Rabbi Gaffney. Again, his student, worked with him for years, work with him now as a collaborator and student. Several different Zen kind of instructors, and retreats and things of that nature. So pursued also the territory, as you will, interested in the maps,
Hmm.
interested in the theory and the theology, but also, uh, you know, wanting to like Coltrane find a way to change and to go inside and to test the claims of these great realizers. So I took that seriously as well. So that's a little bit of it, and now I find myself, working with Ken and Mark in writing projects that are neo-perennialist writing projects, and then also working with people like Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's a major collaborator of mine in the space of mitigating existential risk and metacrisis, these are related topics, very deeply related. So it's a little bit of like a pathway through what brought us to be talking.
Yeah, very cool how you've really been integrating all of these different threads and approaches, and makes sense in the light of talking about first principles and first values, sort of looking for those kind of underlying themes that really unite everything, which I know we'll get into today.
Right.
Also super interesting, just having the image of you like playing jazz, but also philosophizing at the same time. Hope you
I
go
mean,
into,
they're
yeah.
related. I mean, Nietzsche always said, like music is the great seduction, basically, for philosophers. And it's where I experienced what, we now call anthro-ontology or valueception, which would be the perception of value. Like, why is this song better than that song? It's clear when a mathematical equation is wrong or correct. But with music, what does it mean to be off? Those kinds of things became very interesting. So I really credit my experience with music with a lot of that trust of that there's another way of perceiving the world, and there's another way of relating to the value and qualities in the world than scientific materialism, than what's taught in school. Many of the greatest musicians I admire were not really that formally taught, and so they were able to do this uh, without what's typically called the conferral of expertise by the legacy institution. So the kind of like um, position of the prophet outside of the structures of the existing civilization. Also interesting category, the rebel, right? As explored by people like Colin Wilson and others. So the music was like, it wasn't a coincidence. Like, and I bet I encounter a lot of ex musicians, as philosophers.
Very cool. Well, I will actually be at Detroit Jazz Fest this weekend, so I might be walking in there with a whole new mindset now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So Zach, you mentioned the meta crisis, and something that comes up throughout your work, and I should probably mention your book as well with Dr. Gaffney under the pseudonym David Temple, but it's called First Principles and First Values. I'll hold it up here. A subtitle is 42 Propositions on Cosmoerotic Humanism, the Meta Crisis, and the World to Come. So I'm wondering if you could just help define or help us understand that term meta crisis and what you mean by that.
Yeah, totally. So, well, quite a long time ago, and by that I mean, the 90s or early 2000s, Mark and Ken, and Mark leaning into this a lot, began to speak of uh, basically what is now called existential risk. This is human-induced threats to the continuation of the human species, right? And so self-induced human extinction. Um, and Mark coined this term, the second shock of existence. Uh, the first shock of existence is the realization of human mortality. And there are a couple of people like Ernest Becker and others who would claim that that's the thing that actually kind of like boots culture and interiority and a whole bunch of things that we think of as being distinctively human is actually that we're the animal that can consider its own mortality. A lot of stuff follows from that. I'm not going to kind of get into that. Maybe dolphins think about dying and other things, but the point is that really different, really big difference. And that happens in individual child development. You see there's a point where they don't really think about death. And then if you become a mature human being at a certain point, you actually relate to death. And that's the first shock of existence. But never before in history had there been this other category, which was that we all die. There had been apocalypse, but apocalypse is a morally ordered event. Apocalypse is a divinely orchestrated event. It's not some terrible accident or some horrible war or just the exhaustion of the ecosphere as a result of, extraction and pollution that goes exponential. So the self-induced extinction of the planet due to advanced technology is a novel psychological category that Mark was like, this is the second shock of existence. It boots a new type of culture and a new type of psychology necessarily. Now, we've been ignoring it since the 50s because it started, of course, with the bomb. That's when it burst into public consciousness, the second shock. And there were several psychologists like Robert J. Lifton, for example, who pointed this out. He was like, this is the thing. Like, we're gonna repress this. We're going to selectively not attend to this. We're going to forget it so that we can continue with our culture because we don't have the capacity to like really, as a fully mature species, deal with the fact that we now have technologies that could pretty easily destroy all of us, and that they're risky, and that there's no going back to a civilization that doesn't have existential risks as a result of its technology now. So we're on a circuitous path now, always with the possibility of self-induced extinction. Just as I am, my personality on a circuitous route where there's always a possibility of death. So there's a longer conversation about the kind of like technological and sociocultural generative dynamics that led to the meta crisis and the current state of all these risks and things like that, which we can get into. But the broader point is this: it's that even if you don't buy that, you have to understand the scale of possible technological destruction, and that we have the power to do a self-induced species extinction, which we didn't have before. And that comes with a radically new type of responsibility, and a radically new type of culture is demanded, and a new type of personality is demanded. So CosmoErotic Humanism, the work of the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, is attempting to do like a cultural play into that opening, which is an opening around, what are the cultural resources necessary to navigate the meta crisis, and to continually have a civilization that lives with this greater power. So it's the requisite wisdom that would balance and bind that power. And that only comes from having a really coherent metaphysics slash cosmovision slash religious view slash first philosophy or world philosophy.
Mhm.
So there's a deep, deep conversation there, and long discussed as necessary, especially since the end of World War II. This idea that how do we come together as a planet so that we can all survive
Mm.
in a way that is not one group oppressing all the others and forcing them in line, or like a, destructive like regression back to a place where we're not globally connected, and
Mhm.
meaning like going back to the dark ages or the stone ages or something. But the problem with that is that the technological infrastructure is delicate to the point where if it breaks, it is catastrophic. So like a nuclear power plant can't just be left unattended. Chemical processing plant can't just be left unattended. These things overheat, they explode, we all die. Right. So we're in a situation of having to maintain hyper complex technological infrastructure for in perpetuity, which has the potential to destroy all life on the planet. And so we've kind of created for ourselves this immense responsibility to shepherd technological power, but we're not working on the structure of what we call this grammar of value that would allow us to articulate that responsibility and actually encode it in a shared understanding and even things like law and stuff like that.
Mm.
The question of the foundation of the legal code. Why is one law more just than another or better than another? Why are some things sacrosanct as rights or not? We inherited our legal tradition from a legal tradition of natural law, which said, well, because the universe works a particular way, and more specifically, value, meaning the non-visible, non-material, but still imminently effective preferences of the universe, right? So my sense is that, yeah, the meta crisis is pivotal. There's a bunch of work that we were doing at the Civilizational Research Institute with Schmachtenberger, where we lay out some of the details of the infrastructure, social structure, superstructure, kind of like technological, geopolitical, kind of like mess that is this accelerating meta crisis. The framework for this Center for World Philosophy is more focusing on the superstructure or the cultural element, which is the meaning making and sense making, and more specifically the forms of available religiosity and their legitimation and potential for legitimation, which without it is hard to have a civilization that runs on default nihilism or relativism, actually.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Zach? This relativism and that sort of worldview that has seemed to now predominate our society versus the type of worldview or story or way of being that you and your colleagues are talking about, which is more revolving around cosmoerotic humanism and using principles and first values. What's the difference between those things for people who are maybe just brand new to your work or not, haven't really thought a lot about that?
Yeah, so it would make sense that at this point in history that we would be ethical relativists, basically. So what I'm saying is like for many stretches of human history, it was not as apparent how many competing worldviews there were to your own, both in terms of how many had existed over history and in terms of how many are actually on the planet currently existing. So you might encounter some other cultures. And if you're like the Phoenicians or something, you encounter quite a few, but you don't know about the, indigenous Native Americans or Australians. Like you don't know about tens of thousands of years of history tracing transformation. And then when you get science then starts to be its own interesting version of a worldview, which in a different way discredits prior worldviews or attempts to discredit prior worldviews. So with the advent of kind of scientific modernism and kind of scientistic humanism as a default alternative, now you step into culture not a member of a lineage about truth, unless you're born not in the West. Or even if you're born into, like if you're born as a, a very serious Catholic, or you're born as a very serious, practitioner of Hebrew wisdom, you're still in a culture in which the option to leave is completely possible and completely known and completely viable, meaning that you're in a secular culture. So this is just me saying, like, that awareness is so different, the modern awareness of the diversity of the world, historically, and that. And so the idea that, like, oh, here's a set of 10 things that applies to everybody, or here's a set of, practices that make for a good democracy, or those types of things. Personality traits, which are ethical, and those that are not, it's good to evolve out of a simplistic absolutism, which does not factor this kind of like explosion of multi-perspectival capacity that is our historical moment. But it is also the case that in that diversity, there are what we call universal grammars of value, which actually serve as a context for the expression of uniqueness and all these things. So there's like a reconstructive project after the deconstruction of the simple absolutisms, and the kind of like being lost in a multi-perspectivalism, which characterizes most of postmodernity. There's a kind of reconstructive project, which is to trace out those root first principles, first values, which are the universal grammars of value. And that's not like as hard as it sounds, basically, for a bunch of reasons, and we can talk about that. But so that's one view, is that in the historical moment, it would make sense and actually be at times mature to go beyond some simple commitment to like nationalism or a particular set of religious views or something like that that doesn't accommodate science and other religions and other nations. So like, yeah, get out of that. But then don't get lost in the idea that, well, then every position is just as good as every other position, or the things that I hold as sacred actually are arbitrary, cultural construction. And who are we to say that these practices, which kind of look barbaric to me, are bad, and the ones that we do, which seem good, are good? Who's to make those distinctions? How do we adjudicate the differences between very different worldviews? The viewer evolving out of was that, well, oh, the people with more science and more technology and more power are right. And so that's the modernist view. Oh, it's been a growth to goodness, and science got out of this kind of barbarians, and so like kind of the white man's burden to bring this light to the world and all that kind of stuff. And so we're thankfully moving out of that, but now we're in a position where it seems like all conversations about what is most valuable are arbitrary, meaning there's not a way to resolve them that it doesn't somehow ground out in like my opinion and then my ability to like to enforce it. And now this isn't the case with like science and engineering, like, which is to say, we totally think that we can have non-arbitrary conversations about whether that bridge is going to fall down or not, right? Like, let the dudes in who are engineers have that conversation where they deal with reality so that we get a bridge that stands. So secretly, we're kind of committed to that. Although extreme relativists would say even that's some kind of fiction, but it gets hard to maintain because it'll drive over the bridge. But in the domains of value, which is like, okay, is the attention of my child sacred? Meaning I should do anything to protect it from the screen, which I know is preying upon it, right? This is like, to fast forward to where we are now. Or is it just the case that, oh, we happen to think that it's important, but really is it that much more important than like GDP or other things, which seem to be like much more brutally real than like how beautiful that tree is, or how beautiful this view is, or how important my child's attention are, which we feel in our bones are more important than the money and all of that. And yet don't have the language to argue against these secular materialists who would relativize our perception of value and make us feel like there's no way we can kind of really not. It's different than the bridge. It's like, who's to really say if this is bad for my kid, for him to have an identity at 18 like this? Who's to say what a appropriate outcome of adolescent socialization is, or what mature adult behavior is? What is mature? That seems so pejorative, so parentalistic. So we have a crisis of teacherly authority, which is a result of this default stance of a kind of relativism. And again, phase specific, but we've been in it for a very long time. And I think some of the technological innovations and other political motives, I think, have us a little bit trapped here. And so that's disconcerting. So that's one of the projects with CosmoErotic Humanism, would be to try to like take the lid off our ability to start having non-arbitrary conversations about value across difference. Right? So please, yeah.
So what you're saying, Zach, is that there is an inherent value to the cosmos. There are principles that are not simply arbitrary, and the construction of our materialist brain, something that we made up, but there is a direction to the universe. And just have a quote from your book here. Value precedes, you say value precedes life, and that life is contrived in pursuit of cosmic value. And I was watching one of the conversations that you had with Ian McGilchrist, and you were, I think, referencing from his book, his notion that value is as fundamental to the universe as matter, as consciousness, as these things that we think of as like just bottom line truths about the universe. And the proposition was that value is included in that. So I'm wondering if you can help make the case to people, and maybe this is, we'll have to draw this out more through more, I probably need to ask you some additional questions, but I'm wanting you to try to make the case to people that there is value in the universe, and that it's not simply arbitrary. And yeah, just feel free to take that wherever you want to start.
It's interesting. Like, so for most of human history, you would have had to be talking humans into the position, the other position, meaning like for most of human history, the default assumption, which was woven into all the worldviews, philosophies, and identities, was that the universe was full of meaning, that it was not here for no good reason, that there was some plan that my people and I am a part of. Then you get modernity, which interestingly enough begins with people like David Hume to like talk people out of that position and make that position embarrassing. Now, they mostly convince the people who become scientists and gain power and start to run the world, but they certainly don't convince the vast majority of the world population. The vast majority of the world population isn't in the meeting. Right? It's just, they're believers in a religious tradition, for better and for worse, because they haven't had educational systems and other things that have overridden the intergenerational transmission of those traditions. Now, some of those traditions have hardened in reaction to the presence of the secular. That's what I say. And of course, the history of religion is not a happy one. So I'm not like trying to make that claim. But I am claiming that we're in the strange position for a large number of very powerful people, meaning people like you and I who get to work in this space of ideas, that we have to be talking people into the idea that the universe is meaningful. That would have been very odd to our ancestors. So it's just worth saying, like, who has the burden of proof? Is it the Johnny come lately small group of people who are also the people responsible for creating a civilization that's about to self-terminate? Why do they get to set the terms? by which we have the discussion, which is about them overriding your already existing intuition. So the place I start is you already know that it's intrinsically valuable. Your body knows. If you saw a young baby in trouble, you would drop everything and stop that baby from being in trouble, right? If you see a beautiful enough natural sight, you cannot not be profoundly moved. If you see a truly heroic act, I'm not saying like a culturally mediated heroic act. I'm talking about a saving a young child from drowning. That is admirable. Um, and so it's not about talking you into the perception of value. It's about talking you out of the brainwashing that has occurred, that you override what is a God. I mean, I would say God given for like shorthand, but like a provided to you by nature facility, which is discernment about quality, value, what is good. And so I think it's interesting there. So you have to boot from the always already given experience of intrinsic value in your immediate experience now. And this is why people enjoy meditation and other things where there's pointing out instructions. So like, no, there's nowhere to go. You don't have to go read a book. You don't have to talk to a scientist. Truth, reality is right here, right in front of you. You can tell. You sit still long enough, open your eyes. Look, that's beautiful. So you want to have a simple aesthetic space for meditating, because now you're not adorning it with some cultural presupposition. You're allowing the always already presence of beauty, which is organized kind of wholeness, to just be there. And like, if you can't see it, that's on you, because it's there. Just like if you can't, build this chair with this instruction manual that they sent you from IKEA, like that's on you, because like physics says this chair works, right? So similarly, like universe says this is good. Interesting. How do I know that? Because your body knows, right? In my vision, I body. In my body, I vision God, which is the book of Job. So that's usually the way in. I'm not going to have an argument with people about philosophy. I'm going to explore their phenomenological experience and ask them if there's anything that they've read in a scientific textbook which really has the validity to override their gut experience of value. Not their, like, I've seen a bunch of movies and read a bunch of books experience of value. I'm talking like gut experience of value. That's why meditation, nature exposure, exposure to vulnerable individuals like babies, people who have disabilities or illness, elderly people, people who are very vulnerable or impoverished, those types of situations. When you're like, okay, that's why you send very depressed people to go work in the soup kitchen or something. Because you're like, okay, tell me, man, is it meaningless? Or was that a good deed you just did? Like, it's an undeniable thing that was good.
Mm-hmm.
You can't cynically self-protect your way out of that experience of goodness. And people have that experience with all kinds of things all the time. Mm-hmm. And then when they're asked in like philosophy class or like on social media, they'll give a glib scientific, humanistic answer because it's the one that's socially rewarded.
Right, which is that my brain just assigned some meaning to this experience because I was conditioned to think that helping other people is good, and some neurotransmitters were released, and et cetera.
Exactly. And or if you're not in science class, but you're in anthropology or sociology or something, oh, my preference for this type of beauty is culturally constructed. If I had been raised in another way, I could be attracted to this picture that is like a picture of someone being tortured or something like that. Nope. That would be a sick culture. How can you say it would be a sick culture? All cultures are relative. No, they're not. And most people who say all cultures are relative then take often extremely strong political stances against opponents as if they're working with some universal truth, but they're not even close to universal truth. They're working with some weird part of their identity. So it gets deep. It gets deep as soon as you start to deny the obvious.
It's very, kind of funny that like we live in this world of relativism and not everything is relative, although we're so certain that our ideology and worldview is right and the other people are wrong. And
Right.
there's just an inherent kind of irony and
That's what's
paradox to
so
that.
bizarre. That's why I never try to get into like arguments that are philosophical here. I try to point to the performative. And the main thing with the relativism is a performative contradiction, which is a technical philosophical term, which basically means like you can say that, but you can't actually live that. And
Mhm.
you are right now not living that as you are saying that, right? So extreme relativism would be the idea that no view is more correct than any other view, right? But if you're trying to make an argument to me about that, you are in the game of there are better and worse views.
Mhm. Mhm.
The argument is that the relativist view is a better philosophical view than the non-relativistic view, but they're saying that there are no better and worse philosophical views. So right there, you have to say, basically like, okay, we're dealing with a psychological symptom that is pretending to be an argument. What is it protecting them from? What is it doing for them to have this type of completely irrational trump card? The same thing is true for arguments against free will and for extreme nihilism and materialism, which are things you can say from an academic podium, but that you can't live from that presupposition. And the claim to be doing so makes me so fundamentally distrust you that then you've broken your ties to social reality. Right?
Mhm.
Like if you tell
Mhm.
me you think you're living in a simulation for real, I can't trust you at all. Sorry. Like you want to be treated like but if that's really what you think, like as a psychoanalyst, that you are a delusional psychotic person. Like, sorry. It's not actually a philosophical position.
Mhm.
Um, and these are strong statements to take, but again, these are doubled down on by McGilchrist, who starts to actually make very direct comparisons between the things that people with severe right hemispheric brain damage have and the things that materialistic, reductionistic scientists claim to be philosophical arguments. So extreme paranoia, extreme schizophrenia, extreme determinism, uh, the world's a machine. I'm a machine. I do not have free will. I'm being manipulated. You are not real. You might be a zombie. You are not in control of your actions. How could I know that you're real? And there's actually somebody in there. Those are all things said by schizophrenics, people in extreme states of duress who have a underactive right hemisphere or an overactive left hemisphere. The zombie thought experiment is a classic experiment in philosophy of mind, which makes no sense. The simulation arguments are taken seriously. The argues against anything like will or actual responsibility for choice, meaning against freedom, also offered very seriously in ways that so radically neglect the obvious givenness of one's first person experience and the social world that it also reads like, you know, a symptom, not an argument.
Mhm.
But now that's very impolite to say. So it's actually surprising that McGilchrist says that, because now you've gone ad hominem in a deep way. You're saying, actually, I can't take your arguments very seriously because they're so immature. Like you're performatively contradicting yourself right here. Like get some help. like like and so that's tough. So that's again but the academy and the structures that incentivize academic knowledge production and the quality control process and peer review incentivize actually weird niche creation in the realm of ideas rather than kind of like synthetic and comprehensive and like
Mhm.
unity creating.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's that there are structural incentives to say provocative, counterintuitive things and to actually not have to factor the outputs of other disciplines when you're making conclusions within your own discipline,
Mhm.
right? So I could go on and on. There's a lot of implications, but yeah.
Yeah. So there's that element of kind of how academics and scholarly work works as far as having these niche specializations and not thinking holistically about the world. But you also mentioned kind of the preference for left brain thinking, and then this analogy, almost maybe it's not an analogy, of what happens when you're under severe stress of having paranoia or schizophrenia or something like that. And it sort of made me think about like whether we're in a place right now where, because of the stress of the world and because of the crises going on, if that's actually somehow kind of psychologically or somehow pushing us more into this direction of relativism or separateness and not seeing the interconnection or harmony amongst us. Like, I'm wondering if you have thought about that, or if you see it like that there's almost the stress is pushing us closer to this tipping point where we are then forced to reimagine kind of how we're going about our relationships.
Right. I mean, this is kind of McGilchrist's argument in The Master and His Emissary. And it's what we talk about in the First Principles, First Values book as a global intimacy disorder, essentially, is one way to think about it. And it's two ways of saying something that are very similar. Let me think of the cleanest way to say this. So the left hemisphere, and this is me just parroting McGilchrist, right? But the left hemisphere is the one that is attached to your right eye. If you are normally kind of like neurologic, we don't do research on left-handed people, so get out of here. But if you're a right-handed person,
Yeah, I'm a lefty, so I feel very
okay,
excluded, and
I'm sorry. Yeah,
it's
so
still a
all of
mystery
this
how our
may not
brains
apply.
work, but that's
It's
okay.
extremely weird. You're extremely weird. So it's at your right eye, and like if you watch a bird behave, they have the same setup. And if a bird is eating or identifying an insect, it will literally turn its head so that just its right eye is catching the thing. So it's about isolating something from the environment and controlling it for your survival. Meanwhile, when the bird's doing that and like identifying the seed with its right eye, its left eye is just up and it's just scanning the environment, precisely not over determining this is predator or prey or anything. It's from what we can tell, and it's just scanning the environment. It's just open attention. And so the left hemisphere is designed to be balanced out. And there are situations under duress, as you were suggesting, and also situations due to culture and technology where the kind of like default hemispheric situation is one of an imbalance rather than an appropriate rhythm between the two. And again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but it is the case that the culture as a whole, right, can be evidencing a widespread kind of subclinical neurological pathology. Right? And it is worth mentioning that even if you just look at the gut biome and the gut brain axis, right, you could make an argument that we are totally running like like optimal in terms of our well-being, just because of we destroy our gut biome with antibiotics or something, right? So, so that seems clear. So it seems kind of like a no-brainer that as the civilization starts to get more stressful, we get more toxins in the environment. There's more social discord, there's more conflict, that it wouldn't make us more clear with like more insight and kind of like healthier brains. And this is the scary thing when you start to study civilization collapse. You see these kind of downward spirals that set in, right? Where it starts to get worse, and that kind of makes it worse, and then making it worse makes it worse, and then it starts to kind of accelerate. So that is occurring with our nervous systems, I believe. And so that's just important to recognize, like that there's a generator function of continued risk and continued kind of decay of the civilization, which is this feedback loop where the sick brain makes a sick environment that makes a sicker brain. And so, yeah, that's one of the things that needs to be thought about when you're thinking about the future. And when you think about your own life, like how do you actually get yourself in a situation where you are kind of trying to, you know, make it possible for you to be as beneficial to the world as you can be, which means essentially like clarity, which means protect your brain from the screens and from, you know, what you put in your, like what you eat and a whole bunch of other things. So there's that kind of baseline advice before you get into all the abstract things. There's like, yeah, the actual implication of this is take care of yourself. That's again why some of these practices that we've inherited from the religious traditions are interesting, because they're now being demonstrated to kind of promote neurological health, regeneration, and benefit the nervous system and the immune system and all that stuff.
I like this analogy of, or just the parallel between kind of how our nervous system has these negative feedback loops and can go down in a downward spiral, and how the same process can take place collectively for us. And so in keeping with that comparison, it's just got me thinking about, okay, well, just from a psychological level, if you're going through a downward spiral in your mental health or your life, or things are going to shit, basically, what's the way to reverse that? And what comes up for me is the quality of attention, like awareness, and being able to recognize and see what's happening. And I know in your book, I have this written down. You talk about intimacy and the intimacy of interrelated parts in the universe. And something like, actually, no, this was a question. I don't know if you said this, but my question for you was, is attention kind of an organizing force, or helps to propel us more in the direction of intimacy and greater health individually and collectively?
Absolutely. So that's a very kind of prescient question, because David J. Temple kind of communicates with Mark and Ken and I, and there's a book that's actually in process now on attention specifically as a first principle and first value, which is woven into the discussion but needs to be brought out. The book that I'm currently working on in this context is one on techno-feudalism, specifically the attention economy and the predation of attention. And so therefore, you know, the things that can be ontologically justified as intrinsically valuable, we have to protect, because they are the things that continue life and that allow the universe to kind of militate towards life. And attention is among those things, which occurs. And again, all the first principles and first values as we identify them, things like eros and integrity, and, you know, there's 16 of them. So I'm not going to list them all here. They all are present everywhere in the universe, but they take different faces depending on the stage of evolution and the exact position. And so in one form or another, attention has been there from the beginning. And so this is, again, if you're a Whiteheadian, this is an easy thing to hear, right? If you're of that tradition, which believes in the kind of the basic aliveness of the universe, then attention is very, very basic. So again, value, one way to define value would be, it is the result of the clarification of desire. So in your phenomenology, like what's really valuable, it's what is the object of your attention when you have fully clarified what you really want. It's a very interesting thing to say, because value, what is value? It's the thing that is good, it's worth pursuing. And so attention and value and intimacy and eros and the first principles weave, right? So there's a primacy of attention and things that allow us to discuss the need for like a right to sovereignty of attention. And then a responsibility to deployment of attention, right? So a right and a responsibility. Any first principle, first value, when it emerges in the kind of human social sphere, gives a right and a responsibility. And so there's a huge unpacking of just the sacredness of attention, and that being a factor all the way back through biological evolution. Certainly it's easy to see the economies of attention and its placement within the animal kingdom. betraying a deeper trend in instigating intimacy, essentially. And then that kind of climaxing and the kind of cerebralization of the hominid, and the kind of radical capacity for attention that the human child has, specifically what's called joint attention, which is not just me focusing on prey, but you and me looking together at something. And so there's a whole bunch of work that we're doing now in this context and in regards to techno-feudalism, which means the technological disruption of attention, which would suggest that one of the things that makes us human is the ability for long duration joint attention, which is what we're doing right now. You and I sitting together, talking, having long duration joint attention about some reality. To the extent that we can no longer do long duration joint attentional situation, and most of our experience that is shaping what we say and do as a result of interacting with the screen, then we're something else. So there's an attack on some of the most basic species specific traits which emerged very early, which have to do with attention, value, and intergenerational transmission. Right? Again, we're special because we're babies for so long, right? Like, I think if you're an elephant, you're in the womb for like 2 years or something. And you come out and you can walk immediately and like eat and stuff. But humans come out and we basically have another natal period, but in like a nest that's created for us by the elders. And so the duration of intergenerational transmission and the cultural mediation of it and the requirement of having like the ability to look at what mom's looking at for a very long time and understand why she's doing what she's doing without her explaining it and all of that stuff. Other animals just don't do that, right? So it's very, very important to get that attention is not like it's like it's like water or something. It's not like, oh, you can have it or not have it. It's like the substance of intimacy, the substance of it. So just like you can only pull so much oil out of the ground, you can only extract so much attention from the life world, from people's lives. And so there's a limit of extraction, which is utter dehumanization. And that's the breaking of intergenerational transmission through technological disruption of joint attention. And that's occurring right now as a result of the technology. So the argument like, oh, no, it's not like just our opinion in this culture that attention needs to be protected. It is like how nature works, that if you disrupt the attentional system of an organism, it dies. Full stop. Like, you can't blind an animal or give it a neurotoxin. It'll die. But we're doing that all the time, even at a collective level. So, yep, there's like a lot more to say, but that's a little bit of it. And again, I sound quite dire, but my sense is that the generative dynamics that have created the ecosphere we inherited they have not disappeared, right? There are biophilic, meaning loving of nature design approaches that would allow us to have healthy nervous systems again. We just are not motivated to create those technologies. We're creating technologies that return profits as quickly as possible, and other motivations. So it's not like nature has abandoned us. We just, we gave up trusting nature some time ago and are trying to create some artificial world. So the first principles, first values project is also that, it's a return to the ability to perceive the lessons that nature is attempting to teach us, including our own human nature. So the interiority revealed in meditation, when you've done it long enough outside of cultural or in a cultural context that frees the experience, is not, it's not one of, what am I trying to say? Like, you've returned to nature. Like, you've returned to what your body is. That's why we use frames like true nature, right? In the Buddhist frame, right? What is your true nature? How do you see what is actually you? And the miraculous gift of your attention. How the hell do you do that? Like, and the difference, it's like a plant turns towards the sun, right? Like, do you say that the plant is attending to the sun? I would. We're doing totally not, obviously. Obviously, I'm not saying that. I would have to be stupid to say that, right? But I get accused of saying that. But the people who are already defending that their materialism, right? But what I'm saying is like plants attend to the sun. It's super obvious that they do that. And when you get into insects and other things, it starts to be clear that the economy of attention within the animal is one of the main things that evolution seems to be promoting towards, which is to say it's promoting depth and quality of attention, and more specifically, depth and quality of attention that enables certain kinds of coming together in intimacy, right? Mating being the most obvious one, but other things like food acquisition and things of that nature. So again, it's not like with the messing with attention, it's not like we're messing with some small part of what biology values. We're messing with one of the fundamental things. And again, not what our culture values. What
Which doesn't
biology
really
values.
matter. If there are first principles, I mean,
right.
We have to come back to what the universe values and what the universe yearns for.
Precisely. And your body is the way to that. Your body is the way to that. So good question. Yeah.
A number of years ago, I worked in a autism lab, and they were doing research on joint attention, and it just made me think about how obviously we're seeing a growing prevalence of autism developmentally, and I wonder if that is sort of a symptom of something happening more collectively as far as our attention goes. And that's probably, I don't know, a question that we'd be able to answer, but that was that.
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it is worth noting that, like, even a pretty kind of quote severely autistic child is doing more with joint attention than a full-grown normal monkey. It's just for saying that. So like the difference is so extreme between our nearest primate and what even some of our more kind of like neuroatypical individuals do. It's just worth noting that. Now, so the quality of the joint attention is different, but it's not that they don't have access to human joint attention.
Right.
That's important. And but I believe that there is what you're pointing to is nevertheless correct, which is that the culture itself and the technologies are incentivizing dispositions which are, dispositions and even lifestyles, if I can go that far, which do not require extended duration joint attention to exist. So the socialization of a child now, and this is one of the things I worry most about, taking place predominantly in relation to a computer, which is to say, okay, how many hours a day do they spend in long duration joint attention with an adult versus how many hours they spend alone with a screen that simulates being in joint attention because you're watching a video or something like that. That's a very important question, because then you are kind of out of the normal socialization in which the brain has developed. And then you start to get situations. It's hard to know what it's like to be on the inside of someone who has had most of their formative experience with screen. Different than a book, actually, because of the way the screen simulates joint attention and gives a pseudo socialization experience.
And all the while compromising and our attention and not allowing us to practice using those muscles and therefore kind of leading to this more of this atrophy of our attentional capacity.
Yeah. I mean, and like it's kind of crazy really when you think about it, because even if you disregard everything that's being consumed in terms of content, so you're just taking adolescence, like a 19-year-old's feed of, I don't even know, probably Instagram and probably other things that I haven't heard of or whatever. Regardless of what is actually said or what the messages are, kind of like the morals that are transmitted explicitly, the first thing we need to be concerned about is just for example, speed of frame switching in media that is consumed, duration of harmonic melodies, which is to say, how long does it take for this song to be the song? Or is it its song in the first 20 seconds and then you can change to another song because that's the beat or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these deeper structural things below the content which are actually not in your conscious semantic awareness, but are in your subconscious or preconscious nervous system's differential responsiveness.
Mm.
And so that is the level at which things like TikTok are dysregulating. People are complaining about like right-wing or left-wing messages, and totally that sucks. But more fundamental than that is like almost Skinnerian system of flashings and sounds and rapid frame shifts and maximal information compression to another video, which is a different frame shift. That so like you're not attending to anything for more than a 30 seconds. The thing you are attending to during 30 seconds is actually like 20 things because of the compression.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter what the message is that's coming through, the medium is the message. And the message is completely indecipherable to your conscious awareness, and it's fundamentally dysregulating your limbic system, essentially, and your neurotransmitter. And so, and it's pretty precise and algorithmic. So we have to like literally protect the kids from these things, but we're not. And then we have to protect ourselves from them. And they're not designed to make you healthy, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
The most generous argument would be that they're designed to addict us to them. The least generous argument would be that they're designed as large-scale behavior modification systems.
Mm-hmm. Talk more about that. Is this part of what you are referring to when you talk about techno-feudalism? And
Yes,
yeah, tell us more about that.
precisely. So there's some of the work that CRI did, this project called the Consilience Project, which you can look up. And there's a paper on social media enables undue influence. That's the title of the paper. It's a technical term. And in that paper, I explored with a bunch of help the parallels between what we know about advanced coercion and interrogation tactics, sometimes called brainwashing, and the neurological and psychological mechanisms that are leveraged to do that, and what we know about the design features of social media technologies and the neurological and sociological mechanisms that they leverage. And there's a deep parallel to the type of environment that social media attempts to create around your mind and the type of environment that kind of not a good person would create if they were trying to manipulate you into doing something that's not in your best interest. Mm-hmm. So undue influence is a technical legal term, which basically means like he's not responsible for his actions because he has been under such duress that he has been brainwashed into doing that thing. So the most classic case of this is Patty Hearst. Right? So Patty Hearst was eventually pardoned by Bill Clinton in the 90s, but after, I think the 60s or so, I can't remember the exact date, but she was kidnapped by bank robbing leftist radicals. And she was the daughter of, she was the heiress to a fortune. So they kidnapped her for the ransom. They were kind of Marxist, Leninist people, and did not treat her well. But she ended up believing in their ideology very, very strongly. It's sometimes called Stockholm syndrome. Mm-hmm. So you're under enough duress. They get you to keep repeating things under duress. They reward you for saying the things, like reward you with stuff like food for saying the things that you need to be rewarded. They keep you in a state of, fragmented attention. They don't let you sleep. So she then starts robbing banks with them. Even after they're like, totally, we'll pay the ransom. They're like, yeah, she's like, pay the ransom. And then she doesn't go. And she's with them and she's robbing banks with them, like, involved in murders and stuff because she's convinced. And then, of course, they bust him, and I guess she goes to prison and like sees her family again and starts talking to people, psychologists and other people, and all that becomes clear. Like, oh no, like this poor woman, we can't hold her in prison for bank robberies. She was clearly coerced. And similar arguments are made for people who are in human trafficking, who commit crimes. It's like, can you really go to jail for trafficking cocaine when you were basically held captive and tortured until you did so? Like, I don't think so. And where this research began was in the North Korean brainwashing camps. And so I mentioned Robert J. Lifton earlier as one of the psychologists who was grappling with this issue of X risk. He was a Navy psychiatrist. He interviewed the US soldiers who had been held in captivity by North Korean communists and subjected to brainwashing. Incidentally, a lot, not a lot, but a sizable handful were convinced and did not come back. And the tactic there was to, again, deprive of normal nutrition, deprive of normal sleep, fragment attention by rapid task switching, and then put in a circle and talk. And where if you say something wrong, you get punished. If you say something that they like, specifically phrases that they gave you, which Lifton came to call thought terminating cliches. If you use appropriately a thought terminating cliche, you get rewarded to the point where you can start to run circles. Right? Like, and so his realization was that under that kind of duress, you eventually lose the ability to maintain your philosophy of the world because you're so exhausted and so confused. And the basic mechanism of reinforcement around food and sleep and other things and social hierarchy and not getting beat up and stuff has you saying stuff that you don't really believe, like capitalists are evil and communists are great, right? That kind of stuff. And you do that for days and days and days. You're using thought terminating cliches under social pressure in a context you feel like you can't escape, to the extent that you start to believe the thought terminating cliches, and then your identity starts to revolve around these things that have been placed in you, rather than things that you came from your socialization and like long reflection and
Direct experience. Yeah.
with direct experience, long conversations with people you've loved and all of this stuff. And so in my experience, if I'm a strong social media user, is one where I am rewarded or not for the repeating of thought terminating cliches that have been placed in the culture and not created by me. And if I have a business or I'm young and my identity is tied up in social media, then the possible social sanctioning that could result from really trying to argue and like really hold for a more complex view and not just have a polarizing thought terminating cliche be the thing that gets me all my likes. Like, you kind of are in a situation where you can't sleep if you're under the duress of being basically equivalent of bullied by a mob of people who used to like you by the hundreds and now hate you because you didn't repeat the thought terminating cliche that they want you to repeat. And so you can see where you're going. So the intentional creation of a hypnagogic state, which is the attention fracture and the feeling of addiction and the feeling of being trapped and the not sleeping and the bad nutrition and the stuff that is the default environment, in combination with remarkable social pressure to repeat very specific types of ideas, which are not endogenous to your own reasoning, but which receive huge social reward. And then retroactively, if you're smart, you can totally have a bunch of other rationalizations around why you're taking that particular view, which the soldiers did. And many of them became committed communists and didn't go home and stayed in North Korea. And then many came home and were like, what the hell happened to me? Like, God, like, how did I sympathize with the guys who were whipping us with hoses, you know? Like, and so anyway, so there's a longer story to tell about that. So that article shows very clearly that social media has been designed to enable undue influence, which means, and this is another like line into this argument, that's structurally designed that way. If you look at it psychoanalytically and psychodynamically, and even from like a behaviorist reinforcement standpoint, but then from just like just from like a business model standpoint. Facebook, for example, how do they make money? They are an advertising company. Full stop. What do advertising companies do? How do they get people to invest in them? We can get people to do stuff. That's what advertisers do. We are good at manipulating behavior at large scale. So Facebook's proposition to you is connect to your friends, look at cat pictures, like be a political activist. Their actual proposition is we control behavior. So to think it's very clear. Their proposition to the shareholder isn't we make people's lives better and make their brains healthier and make their relationships more wholesome and depolarize the political space. Nope. It is you put your ads on here, you will make money, which means you put your ads on here, we'll get people to buy your stuff, which means we can affect people's behavior. And we know from the research they're doing internally that they're trying to get better at doing that. And then all of the different social media companies have that same value proposition.
You mean holding your attention? It's just, you're saying eyeballs, right? And attention on the screen.
So that's the first way they manipulate your behavior, which is to get you to just look. So that's the most obvious thing. But then they are trying to get you to do things in the world or not do things in the world, like vote for this person, do this biomedical intervention, right? Like go to the street, protest, or not. And so the modulation of human behavior, and very specifically the knowing when you're scrolling, because it's tracking your behavior, reinforce you with X or Y. And that's back to the original thing. It's beneath the message is their capacity to have dysregulated you enough and to understand the feedback mechanisms of how you work, and specifically the social reinforcement mechanisms that solidify identity, which is the socially sanctioned repetition of thought terminating cliches. Which again, you don't need a lot of long form joint attention to just like be on the same page with someone about a slogan you didn't create, right? That's on a sign that you purchased from a group that you don't know. So yeah, I think it's at the point of like, you end up sounding like a conspiracy theory, but like I'm just telling you things that are in the public domain about how we know psychology works and how we know the social media is actually designed. And then what we know about how the companies work would mean that they'd be maximally incentivized to create a technology that can manipulate your behavior because they're an advertising company. If they were like a social well-being company and the metric was not advertiser revenue, but some other thing, like, I don't know what it would be, but you can imagine many, 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 many other things that would be good for the objective function of the Facebook algorithm to go towards. But this is the thing they're doing, maximal behavior control. And then a thing like TikTok is just like that on super drive. And that is super concerning at like many, many, many levels. So that's that arc. And again, that paper lays it out in pretty graphic detail. And then most people are like, yeah, but not me, because I use Facebook in a different way or something. That's like most reaction of like reflective people is like, no. Yeah, that's how they want you to, but no, I have some special resistance to this. That kind of thing. Nope, no, you don't. Totally don't. We just have to recognize that and actually relate to those technologies as predatory. And recognize them for what they are, not what they claim to be. There's a whole bunch of other things. So I think it should be illegal for young children to have it possible for their identity to be solidified in those environments. I think that should be a mouse, which means like not until you're 18 or something do you get to have your identity solidified through like asynchronous, fucking massively distributed, quasi-anonymous social sanction for thought terminating cliche use. But this is I'm obviously not on social media, but this is my cynical view. And even if you don't buy the whole thought terminating cliche thing, you have to think about the evolved environment in which your nervous system was genetically selected for, and the environment under which your nervous system is now constantly in duress from hyperstimuli. So like if you go to the movies rarely, as I do, when you go to a movie after like 5 years not having been to a movie, you realize how completely overwhelming a movie theater experience is for a human nervous system. That like we should not have young children in these. But we take it as very normal. We just have to remember there was nothing even closely resembling this for the vast majority of the time that the humans have been on the planet. And we have not been in these environments for long enough for our nervous systems to have genetically modified themselves. So there are boundaries to what counts as a healthy nervous system and the conditions under which a nervous system can remain healthy. And we have crossed those boundaries almost at a planetary scale. And so it's like if you're not into the brainwashing thing, you just have to think about like the toxicity thing, which results from something like a never-ending movie theater experience being your major mode, which would be your mode if you had headphones on and had a thing in front of you for 8, 9, 10 hours a day. So yeah, it's intense. Like it's very hard for me to predict what the intergenerational transmission processes will look like over the next, say, 25 years.
I have follow-up questions. I also recognize that we've gone over an hour. You've been so generous, and I know it's a beautiful day where you are. So are you up for another follow-up question or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I want to just keep pulling on this a little bit.
And
yeah.
but the thing to get here is like advertising works by distorting your perception of value. So this is the kind of bring the whole thing in. This is why in the book on Techno-feudalism, we talk about value and we talk about attention and their relationship. So to the extent that they've captured your attention, they've distorted your ability to perceive what is valuable. I mean, the Hebrew attention basically means the placing of the heart. Right? So if you're focusing on something, it means you value it. If you're focusing on something that's actually not valuable, you've been tricked into thinking that it's valuable. That's what advertising is by design. So this conversation about value and the ability to know what's actually valuable and to know what's not directly tied into this conversation about, oh, this is a massive advertising engine, which means it's a massive thing that's trying to distort everyone's perceptions of what's actually valuable.
Okay. So my question around that is if you think that there's a deeper underlying motivation around that, beyond simply just maximizing profit, basically. I'm curious to get your take on that. What's the motivation? What's the underlying motivation for being able to control people's attention or strip their attention in that sort of way?
Yeah, totally. I mean, and we lay this out very clearly, and it's one of the things that the existing critics of the techplex, like Zuboff and who wrote Surveillance Capitalism, and even people like Tristan Harris and others, who are making these brilliant arguments, and they should be listened to, and they're mostly true. But there's an underlying thing, which is that, and I've mentioned the emergence of existential risk after World War II as a category. Psychologists paid attention. B.F. Skinner, knew Robert J. Lifton. B.F. Skinner was super worried about the bomb and basically said, we need to replace politics. So replace politics with a science of behavior control. Because if we don't, we're all going to die. That was his argument. So basically, the underlying motivation is a benevolent, technocratic futurism.
How does that help save us from the potential destruction of the bomb, having scientific control?
Yeah, because I mean, so right now you imagine his view, and still it's hard to be like that, is that we have the basically nervous systems and cultures of like barbarians and like pre-modern people, but we have the technologies of gods. And so Skinner was like, it's insane the difference between what is produced by science and what is possible politically because of the backwardness of the political state. So, for example, pollution. Everybody's driving cars. Everyone's throwing away plastic bottles. what do we do? Skinner's like, just make a operant conditioning chamber that is as big as the society. And you never have to tell them you're trying to stop them from throwing plastic bottles away. You just incentivize and disincentivize certain behaviors with nudging, and you create an environment where you just eliminated the pollution problem through a science of behavior control rather than through some political argumentation where you pass laws and then enforce the laws. And the laws are contested because of special interests. He's like, screw that. He's like, the technocratic engineers will bring the human sciences to a point where we can organize large-scale behavior technocratically rather than politically. So a scientific elite replaces a political elite, and the scientific elite is a class of human engineers who largely do not reveal their work to the public. This is B.F. Skinner. This is not
So
Zach's crazy.
this is documented.
He's writing this.
From
Okay. Yeah. No. And so in the book that's coming out, which is the follow-up to First Principles, First Values, David J. Temple's been working on these comparisons between Skinner's writings, which are what I'm recounting to you, and the writings of people like Alex Pentland, who had students all over Silicon Valley and kind of claims to be kind of one of the creators of the internet, similarly arguing for a replacement of politics with a science of behavior control. And so again, it's like nudging is the classic example, which is a accepted form of coercive behavior that is deemed to be socially appropriate, which is basically like, oh, we want to drop obesity and stop people from drinking soft drinks. What do? We nudge them into the right decisions rather than dictate to them educationally or have some conversation about it. We create through social media, advertising campaigns, a whole bunch of disparate channels, an environment in which that thing just isn't incentivized anymore. And this thing is, that used to be very hard to do. And Skinner was like, we need different, techniques and methods and technologies. And so with the advent of the internet, those became available. And so, so Walden 2 is his utopian novel where he lays this out. Beyond Freedom and Dignity is Skinner's book where he lays out very explicitly this argument about basically X risk, that we're all going to die. He says simple things like, we have to get beyond the immature get beyond the immature philosophies of human dignity and freedom. Like, oh, okay. Like basically saying like that's the impetus, the impediment, the thing that's stopping this replacement of politics with a science of behavior control is these silly philosophies of human dignity and freedom. And so yes, the broadest design, if we're like giving the absolute benefit of the doubt, is that it's a benevolent technocratic intervention into an increasingly unwieldy and complex society where we have to find ways, like during COVID or during some climate thing or other things, to coordinate large-scale behavior. And given current failures of rule of law and all of these other things, it becomes kind of almost a no-brainer that some technocratic class would step in, couple tools to the nation state, and provide these technologies, which again, they've always been aspired to. They tried to do this with television. Part of the Consilience Papers is this long history of propaganda. But the argument we're making in Techno-feudalism is exactly that. And you have to annihilate value from the cosmos to be able to look the possibility of removing all human freedom from human life as better than all the humans dying, right? Like, there's one perception on the problem. I'm not like endorsing this. I'm saying it's a perception I can see, in which an endless state of totalitarian value lock-in would be worse. It would be thousands of years.
Yeah. Well, if it's violating assuming there are first principles of the universe, so right? It would be in violation. So this better to die and reincarnate with the momentum of the first principles going or something like that.
Now you just, for Skinner, like die and reincarnate, blah, 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 blah. He's just like, come on. But that's exactly the insight, which is that, oh my God, like if we don't reconstruct value, there's no argument against this class of people who have kind of good intentions to free us from our freedom. Right.
So I wanted to ask you about that because here, right, you and Dr. Gaffney and others are laying out these first principles and are essentially saying that these it would be good. There's an inherent goodness to these principles. The universe prefers these things. Now, if let's just say you guys had the power, had ultimate power in the world or something like that.
Thanks.
But
Hopefully so.
and fully believe that it would be good to act in this way, and that if people don't, it poses an existential risk to humanity. I think maybe you just answered my question, but my question was, if you truly believe that this is the right way to act, as maybe these groups of individuals do that you're referring to, like they have to act in this way or we're going to die, like what would you do in that situation? If do you know what I'm saying? Like, would it be better just to die, or how do you get people, if not through science and behavioral control, to adopt these first principles, um, if they're not going to do it through control?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This is the kind of, who was it? Yogi Berra said something like, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. Right. So this is kind of like one of those choices that's put before the left hemisphere, which is not actually a choice in reality. But Thanos in the Marvel movies, which I haven't seen, but this is one of the narratives in the Techno-feudalist book. We try to reference it to culture. But Thanos in public culture takes that role. He's faced with that question. Like, either I kill basically half the population to save the other half, or everybody dies. Something like that. And then by population, I mean beings in the universe. So you kill half the beings in the universe to save the other half. That seems to be his choice that's forced upon him. And there's a few things to say in response to this, and we try to answer this rather elliptically, I think, because it's hard to answer directly. There are right now two main scenarios that are unfolding for the planetary future. We call them two or twin attractors. Attractors we take from like complexity theory, meaning like the thing is, you look at it and you think, is there some pattern here? But in fact, there's two underlying patterns here. Attractors in a chaotic space. One is chaos, like just deepening disassembly and fragmentation and breaking and catastrophe. And so you can see it end that way, like Mad Max, until it's all over. The other one is oppression. Oppression responding directly to the emerging chaos. So the twin attractors of chaos and oppression, essentially. And so if you do not think there's a third attractor, then most people would pick oppression, but not everybody. Right? Not everybody.
Right.
Some people are kind of cool with like the whole, like, I'll be the warlord or whatever. Like, because I've got the rockets, like Musk would like maybe like to see it, and then he emerges as a post-apocalyptic emperor of the world or something. So there's some people who kind of lean into the chaos because they think they can navigate, and other people who kind of are okay with how it is. Let's just lock this shit in and just shut up and just make this thing work. And of course, these interrelate, because the more you try to lock it down, the worse it breaks, and then it gets worse. Then you lock it down harder, and so there's like a really shitty story that we could do this for a long time. So the oscillation between those two neglects this hidden third, which is this third attractor, which is neither of those, but it is also a little bit of both of those. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way to frame it. It's very abstract that we have to think about, like, okay, it's not some concrete thing like, oh, we, get the global economy on the blockchain, or like we remove all the borders. So it's like there's not a utopian answer to this question. There's a directionality, which is
Mm-hmm.
preferred by the universe, right? So that's the key thing, which is to say there's a faith in the truth of that statement,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that the thing doesn't want to self-terminate. So like if you're
Right.
a transhumanist, then evolution says, they read evolution as resulting in this almost necessarily. If you're a radical transhumanist, you'd say something like, yeah, the carbon-based life forms got to a point of complexification where the carbon-based life forms booted the silicon-based life forms. And then all of biological life was like a loading program to get out of it. Like, why would you want to be in a like meat and bones and snot and piss and shit when you could be in like crystalline silicon and live forever? And so that's like evolution's trajectory, is to actually get out of the biological. And uh, another view is just that the biological evolution was so arbitrary that the idea of a random planet somewhere kind of spouting out some life, and then it creates this weird mutant monkey that then kills all the life on the planet, that's like kind of makes sense because nature's, you know, rough. um, but neither of those views are true. um, Nature creates so much complexity that does not turn around and create and destroy nature. Like, nature is in the business of continuing itself. It's not in the business of creating something that then terminates itself. It's a weird, if you really think about how many billions and billions of years that the biosphere evolved into increasing complexity, never at which point did that complexity then create risk for all of the rest of the life on the earth. And but now it has produced this thing, namely us, which somehow has the destiny to destroy all of the life. It's precisely all the life it depends on, it turns around and destroys. Like, that's a strange thing that's not written into the evolutionary. This is an aberration. This is some type of thing like a cancer, or you know, stepping out of the field of value. We sometimes talk about, meaning if you lose the perception of value, then you start to do things and you can get pretty deep into confusion about what's valuable. So so that's the first thing. To get that there's a third attractor, you have to understand that the universe has not selected for us to self-terminate. And that includes leaving our bodies and uploading and going to other planets and all that. And that's self-terminating the biology on this planet.
Yeah.
This thing wasn't built. Many people subtly believe that, or believe like, oh, there is no preference really in evolution. And if the humans die, so what? There's billions of other things. And you're like, whoa, dude, no.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that even if we do escape this planet or our bodies, we'd have to kind of pay off the same like
I mean,
shit that we're not dealing with now.
right.
It'll just,
I mean, it's important to get how science fiction has misled us. Like, it's very difficult to escape the planet with these bodies. Like going on Mars and stuff, people talk about that, but we would have to have fundamentally different skeletal structures and internal organization and other things to live for extended duration under that gravity. And so a lot of those fantasies we've been given as if they're possible, but they're actually not possible if we remain this species. We could become cyborgs or genetically engineered organisms that can survive under those conditions, but humans as we've known them will not explore space. That's my argument. So we have to get used to living here, or we have to become comfortable with the idea that this entire history of this whole planet's biological evolution resulted in a creature that had the destiny to destroy all of that and create something else, something that was based on various. So there's that. So you have to think, okay, wait, we have to somehow get back into the perception of value to the extent that we can begin to recode civilization, essentially. And this is what the religious traditions, and especially the emergent axial traditions, did in the context of local civilizational overshoot and collapse and moral degradation. So most of the stories, you know, in the Bible are about these cities, and the cities are, and we destroy the city, and good people leave the city, and you know, and there's much discussion, of course, just with the history of the Hebrews leaving Egypt, right? And the notion of how you can have a civilization that predates on the human substructure, right? A civilization that runs on injustice and the mistreatment of the orphan and the mistreatment of the widow and the mistreatment of the stranger and the captive, right? Which are some of the main things discussed in kind of like Talmud. It's like, you know, the categories of the stranger, the captive, the widow, the orphan, which would be the categories most foreign to the reigning demigods that ran the city states in, ancient Mesopotamia, and that got this whole type of thing going. So there's a class of creative endeavor, a type of personality that whose job it is to basically say, whoa, like return to reality, specifically the reality of what's actually valuable. Don't believe the idols that are being put before you. Get back to the situation where you have the practice that allows you to be like, no, that is wrong. This is right. Um, and uh, and it sounds, maybe too absolutistic to say this is wrong and that is right, but at the end of the day, that is what human culture must do. Uh, and and we've lost the ability to do that easily in many cultural contexts, um, and have thought terminating cliches, kind of like simulating thinking, and the more back to the left hemisphere runs on a simulation of reality, and then often superimposes its simulation on reality, which is like projecting. The right hemisphere doesn't model reality at all, which is also it's just open to perceiving reality. Civilizations, it appears when you look at the history of civilizational collapse, they create simulations of the world, which then they give to the people within the civilization that confirm the goodness of the civilization. So there's a simulation. And at first, the simulation is just a re-representation, meaning, oh, that's actually happening. Here's a story about it. So that's cool. But then it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, where first there's a class of people who know that they're re-representing reality and kind of lying a little bit. And then there's a class of people who forget that reality actually matters, which is 3 stages deep in what we call the Baudrillard wrote about this in Simulation Simulacrum. And so we're at a situation when right before civilization collapse occurs, the heart of the civilization is kind of like maximally convinced that the civilization is doing great because they're in a simulation of reality, not in reality. And accounting allows for this. Like the classic examples are the Mesopotamian collapses, where you have a king that aggregates a lot of labor. He's got an administrative class that is counting the bushels of hay and other things that they're bringing in as taxation on the basically indentured or enslaved servants. If they bring a report that he doesn't like, he kills them. So they start fudging the numbers. And so they're bringing, oh, we got tons of it all, and he's not. He's the king. He's trusting his simulation of what the actual situation is with the food available for the population, which has been systematically distorted through the accounting process. So this sounds familiar, right? So you start running on a secondhand report of what's actually occurring on the ground, making decisions, push people too far. There's actually not the food that was available. The crops haven't been yielding as much as you thought. The fucking river comes and floods, and the whole city disappears within 6 months. And all you have, and and it was a result of the increasing distance of that civilization's decision-making mechanisms from the actual reality that the civilization was in.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot like what happens with extreme left hemispheric imbalance, where you cannot be convinced of something that's obviously incorrect. Like this, like, whoa, you're really living in a delusion here. That's the left hemisphere creates delusion.
Yeah.
And it's happening, of course, currently. And this, of course, ties into the whole social media thing and other things into this general theory of civilizational simulation, and then the role of the religious discourse in that context. Hopefully the scientific one, if it isn't captured in the interest of the simulation, as religion can be as well. But there needs to be a truth stating discourse. This is why they kill the prophets at first, of course, but there's a discourse that calls the simulation out for what it is, and then reorients the civilization to reality, hopefully in time. And so that's like a modality of speech that needs to become, we need to be comfortable with that. And right now there's an immune system within the culture to the emergence of that kind of what would be ethical leadership, essentially. And that's complex, very complex problem. That's like I said a lot there. But
no, that's great. This idea of the left hemisphere, also being the part that is obsessed with order, and right hemisphere being more open to chaos. But you're saying we're more in this left hemisphere phase that loves to represent the world kind of symbolically, or is not able to update to reality. And so, I mean, really, that to me, that just sounds like, too much order and not enough chaos, which is kind of the not knowingness and being able
Mhm.
to update, and then this capacity of attention being able to kind of mediate those things.
Right.
So it almost seems like, as you said before, like we had some idea of how reality works and how it should work, and we just continue to double down on that thing and to add more order, more order, more order, because it's scary to not know another solution, like to jump into that chaos. But if we are able to let go of that to some extent and bring attention to feel and recognize what works, which probably maybe some first principles would reveal themselves, then that provides this other way of being able to navigate, not just jump into nothingness, but there are principles waiting us for us there if we just are open and pay
Yeah,
attention to them.
exactly. And that's a good way to kind of like split that difference, right? Which is to say, if you're thinking about the third attractor, it's going to be like nothing that we've seen, because what we've seen just oscillates between those two. Um, it is either too much order or too much chaos. And then the people who like order hate the people who like chaos, and vice versa. Whereas you're talking about this collaboration between chaos and order, basically, which is what the hemispheres do. Your brain shouldn't be in a state of harmony. It should be in a state of synchrony. It's different, which means your hemispheres should be maximally doing two different things and then coordinating those two different things, rather than your hemispheres doing both doing the same thing. If your hemispheres are both doing the same thing, you're actually not, probably having a stroke or something. It's not good, or a seizure or something. But so in an ideal situation, there is that parallax. You go deep parallax, which means two views simultaneously overcrossing, giving the thing that's real. And so that is really the third attractor. It's neither of those two. Right now, we will oscillate between chaos and oppression. What we need is this like complex self-organizing thing that is alive, that heals itself, not a thing that breaks and disassembles and is toxic. Um, and that's very complex to think about as a civilizational design parameter. But in one's own personal kind of like orientation to life, thinking about the degree to which you oscillate between those two, like completely ordered in the work world, and then on the weekend you're like just fucking a mess drinking, and like kind of like back to that, like the degree to which you move between these poles of like the disassembly, which is super important to be able to undo structure. Hillman talks about the puer, which is the archetype of like the exploding, youthful, like breaking energy that like can't stand like boundaries and like the old people. That's a super important part of your ego, to be able to just be like. But then there's this other one, the Synex, which is like the old man, which is all about order, keeping the puer shut up and kind of like counting things and predicting things and money and all of that stuff. And so his book Synex and Puer talks about these as functions within the self, which have to be somehow balanced. You need the Synex sitting there with the Puer on his lap, rather than them fighting or oscillating. So I just went kind of up into the archetypal. But for internal work, it's actually key to get. And Steiner also talked about, Rudolf Steiner, the luciferic and the Ahrimanic and the Christ-like. And the two, Ahriman and Lucifer, are devils in isolation. They're not good, but bound by this third, which is not oscillating between them, but which uses this energy, one being breaking apart, the other being binding, which you saw as evolutionary forces. So that right weighting of the breaking and the binding is also a part of our definition of eros, which is the coming together, but also the breaking apart in the interest of the better, higher order coming together, which is in our phenomenology what we experience with the always kind of evoking and moving forward of the kind of like draw towards greater wholeness and intimacy, which isn't always just staying, or just kind of like always just holding kind of one form of order. Eros is the thing that actually kind of like breaks order in the interest of new order, right? People who are into thinking about Eros will sometimes emphasize one or the other. oh, it's all coming together, in which case it's just like a big love fest. Or they see Eros as kind of this destructive radical thing, which kind of breaks things apart, right? So it's deep to see that, yeah, the polarity isn't resolved by moving between them. There's this unarticulated third. And in yeah, so that's some like interesting stuff. And again, with meditation, in like if you do deep phenomenology, it's similar. It's like your breath is both in your control and not in your control.
Hmm.
That's like very, very true. You pass out right now, you'll keep breathing for sure. You sleep, you're breathing, right? But you can totally breathe when you want to. And so those moments in meditation, the focus on the breath, what you're drawing attention to is that point, the third point, which is actually where you are, which is at that interface of that, of what can be controlled and what cannot be controlled. And that's, a very general lesson. And again, the metabolic processes of the body are super interesting because I don't beat my heart. I have no idea how to digest my food, like at all, but I do. You know what I'm saying? And so that awareness of like the ontological dependency of me upon these processes, which I didn't create, don't fully understand, that were given to me by nature, and then the arrogance of those who think that nature somehow made a big mistake and like science needs to correct that mistake by fixing death, for example, which is an ambition that is had. That's a profound misunderstanding of your own, like a profound absence of gratitude for like the living value within you that will, allow your body to grow and heal itself without you having any idea how that cut heals. Couldn't explain it. And even if you knew the science, you're like, it's not your own really. You can't really explain. And so that's, I think, an important thing too, is that in your own experience, you can touch that in your body, And that's why people are afraid of their bodies and other things, because there's a part of you that you're not in control of. There's a part of you that is beyond your conscious ability to regulate and control. Now, if you're a yogi, supposedly you can control your heartbeat and your autonomic nervous system and stuff like that. But I certainly can't do that. So, like, if I'm embarrassed, you see it on my face, right? If I get excited, my heart rate accelerates. And I don't make that happen. I can't stop that from happening. And so I believe things like prayer and things like expression, even certain meditative states are that. Like one way of thinking about the presence of the sacred is that. So it's this uncontrollability that is yet also in our interest and fundamentally friendly. So it's Einstein's question: is the universe friendly? So it's basically, and our answer is like, yeah, totally. They're very friendly, in fact, like more than you can possibly imagine. You can't even get that. You can't even give the gratitude necessary to the universe.
Thank you for such a stimulating conversation. Yeah, I'm sure we could talk on and on and on, but is there anything else that you wanted to share for today?
I don't think so. Just that this book is the beginning of a very large project, which we call the Great Library, of CosmoErotic Humanism. So David J. Temple's this kind of pseudonym, quasi-pseudonym. It's been created to allow for collaborative authorship. And so the Center for World Philosophy and Religion is hoping to release, dozens of books, and that's not hyperbole, in the coming years, which are all along these same themes. And just trying to lay the groundwork for not that we have like the answer, but that actually a new type of conversation can be convened about these planetary issues of religion, ethics, coordination, which if we don't resolve them, they're not technical issues. They are social, political, spiritual issues. So yeah, so in that sense, kind of stay tuned. It's hard to write books, so they take longer than you think, but we've got a lot of them very far along in the drafting stages. And so I'm excited as these start to drop in the culture, what the effect might be had.
Fantastic. Where can people keep an eye out for that? I will post a link to your website and any other,
Yeah,
but
Center
where
for
else can
World
people find you?
Philosophy. Yeah, if you just Google Center for World Philosophy and Religion, you'll find the center, and you'll probably find the press that we set up, and the press is set up for all these books that are coming down the pipe. So that's there. And I mentioned the Consilience papers a couple times. Those are worth looking into, especially on this topic of propaganda. Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Zach. Thank you so much.
Right on, man.